Welcome to another Truth in the Barrel Devil's Cut episode. I'm Amy McGrath, and today we're talking to author and U.S. Army Special Forces veteran and co host of the Surf and Turf Show, currently broadcasting over at the Valor Media Network, Dan Pace. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks for taking the time to have me on the show.
Yeah, well, Dan, for everyone, we know you joined the Army at 21 and spent 2 decades as a special forces guy. And I want to just start out and kind of give everybody a sense for who you are, why you joined the Army, and why did you decide to do a job that is probably like the hardest, most elite job in all of the United States military, and I actually would say in all of the world. So let's start there.
I think the story's maybe a little underwhelming, but when you graduate, I graduated college in 21, at 21 back in 2001, January. And so, when you graduate with a philosophy degree, your options are relatively limited professionally. You like go to grad school, maybe go to law school. None of that was sounding appealing. Just wanted something a little more exciting. So a friend of mine and I walked over to the Navy recruiter actually to join. But as you know, government lunches being what they were, he was closed. He was closed from 11:30 to 1, and we were at the mall already. We'd driven over there. We spent our whole morning getting there. I just walked over to the Army recruiter, which was not closed, for lunch instead, and joined, and signed up for the infantry because it seemed
Just
like
like
an
that.
exciting, just on a complete
Navy
whim.
guy wasn't
Just
around, so you're just like, "Yeah, I'm gonna join the Army."
I knew so little about the military that I think probably the one was as good as the other to my 20-year-old, 21-year-old brain. Just, hey, we're just going to do what we're going to do. And it kind of just worked out, I guess.
But but Dan, it's one thing to join the Army. It's another thing then to go be a Green Beret. So, right? Because you were a Green
Yeah.
Beret. So
Yeah, for
tell
sure.
us what is a Green Beret and like how hard is that?
So the Green Berets are the nation's unconventional warriors. So basically, it's an MOS in the Army that is kind of super infantry, and it's designed to partner up with people from other countries, and then to do work in those other countries in small teams, on behalf of the U.S. government. So sometimes that can be working with an allied force in Afghanistan or Iraq. Sometimes it could be working with an insurgent force in a country that we want to disrupt the operations of. It's it's small footprint. It's very kind of alone and unafraid, and it kind of prides itself on working alone and getting things done.
When you joined, did you know you wanted to go that route, or was that something later on where you're just like, "Hey, I think this is what I wanna do after
So
seeing all
honestly,
the jobs that are available."
when I joined, I didn't know what a Green Beret was. I kind of you pick in this catalog, like they had this big '90s flip book of jobs, and they had one of a guy in a parachute. It was like, I want to be that, and so we went to be in the infantry. And then when you work in the infantry for a while, and I deployed a couple of times as an infantryman, and you see the special forces guys around you doing their jobs, it just looked infinitely more appealing. And so I decided to kind of stop the infantry thing and go to the special forces thing. And it was a long pipe. It takes about a year and a half to 2 years to finish, but by the time you get done with it, it was very much worth it.
Do all Green Berets go through Ranger School?
No, no, they don't. So
Really?
they don't. So Ranger School is a funny one. You got to suss it out a little bit. But anybody in the Army can go to Ranger School. 62 days. It's a fairly miserable school. When you graduate, you kind of learn a lot about yourself, and it's really challenging. But then you're qualified to either go be a Ranger at Ranger Battalion, which is kind of its own little special operations unit, or you can just go back to your job, whether it's a personnel clerk or an infantry guy or a special forces person, and you'll have your Ranger tab. So you can be qualified and not necessarily be a Ranger, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, so in your 20 years or the time frame that you were a Green Beret once you got qualified, where are some of the places you went? And what were some of the things that you did?
So, gosh, it was
I
busy.
know you
So,
can't narrow it down, but
but a lot of Afghanistan, Iraq were the two big standards. I think everybody in the army did those. Did some time in Uzbekistan. Did a lot of time in Latin America. So across Latin America, moved to Europe, lived there for 4 years. Did work in Europe and did a little bit of work in Africa, although not a whole lot. So a bunch of places.
now that you are out or you did 20 years and got out and you sort of have done a lot of things since you've been out. You have written a book or two, right?
Hmm.
A
Two
couple of
books, yes.
books. You have your own podcast, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Um, and you consider yourself a military ethicist. Am I right? What is that?
So yeah, we all pick up kind of our passions over the course of our careers, like the things you just really care about, even though there's really not a lot of incentive to care about them. And military ethics is one of those for me. So I one of the special forces struggles with some ethical issues, as you would imagine. You see it all in the newspaper. We all understand, the headline making stuff, but just the reality of having guys work so far ahead of everyone else and kind of by themselves, and particularly in close proximity with indigenous personnel. So tribesmen from Africa, Afghans out in kind of the eastern border area of Afghanistan, which is super remote. You end up guys having kind of trouble with, I guess, what's called moral drift, where you just start to lose kind of focus on kind of what that core value of growing up in America looks like, and you really start to kind of get sometimes a little too close to the folks you're working with. And I have a passion for trying to figure out how to train that, because I think it's damaging to guys long term. I think a lot of the PTSD you see, a lot of kind of the failure to adapt you see in these really senior, really frankly like heroic guys that come home and have trouble adapting, is due to a lot of that. And I just have kind of a passion for trying to figure out how to fix it.
Yeah. And you make the point where, hey, this isn't something that we should be doing individual training for. It really needs to be kind of a unit, a collective training.
It's challenging. So what I think is appropriate ethically in a situation, let's say that you're my commander and you're sitting in Virginia and you are talking to me in East Africa and I'm working a situation there. Now, I might, over the course of 6 months, end up seeing, particular my partners, do a lot of stuff that would in no way be acceptable in America in terms of like treatment of prisoners or rules on the battlefield or the way that they handle situations in terms of looting, detainee abuse, worse, far worse. And over time, like my ability to communicate what's going on over here to you can start to get fuzzy and limited, because if I tell you too much transparently, it can actually kind of put the mission at risk, because the people in the rear don't necessarily have the context to understand what the guy forward is dealing with. And so
Mhm.
when I say it's a collective decision, there has to be this way to have a conversation about that without immediately drawing, I don't want to say scrutiny, but a lot of times, lawyers will immediately get involved. And what do you mean detainee abuse and this and that, or the newspaper get involved, and it can collapse the whole thing. And nobody wants that. But at the same time,
Right.
if we don't address it honestly, it's just going to keep happening. And we see the symptoms of this play out frequently. And so I try to push units to train to that standard. Say, hey, you're going to see questionable things. You have to be able to honestly communicate that to the decision maker in the rear, so that that person can understand what's going on forward and not kind of gloss over and kind of maintain any plausible deniability about it. That's a super not constructive perspective that I think keeps getting us in trouble repeatedly.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. It appears to be a huge issue. I mean, obviously, I've never been on the ground in special forces, but I can understand where that's coming from. And there's not a whole lot of JAGs out there with you, right?
No, and no, there's not. And we're playing by a completely different set of rules. So you're playing with people in a sovereign country where it's completely okay for them to do that. And your presence there kind of underwrites the behavior on behalf of the United States, which the United States doesn't necessarily want to put its name on, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily want to sever ties with the organization you're working with, because it's important for it
Right.
to be there and working with it. And so it was an endless problem in Afghanistan. It was a problem in Iraq, and it's a problem pretty much everywhere we work. So it's a challenge that we have to overcome.
It's a huge challenge, and we have to understand that the partners and sometimes allies that we work with don't always share the same values that we have.
That's
And
right.
at what point do you sort of impress your values upon them? And it's just a really tough nut. The other thing is, if you sever ties with these folks, the mission doesn't get completed, and there's no way for them to even see your values. I could imagine as a Green Beret, Dan, that the partner forces are watching you too.
Hmm.
They're watching to see how you handle things. They're watching to see what your values are, because you are the gold standard in terms of some elite things that you can do in the military, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And so you end up trying to balance the, well, over long term, I want to bring this kind of country's values more in line with, the traditional sort of Western values to kind of bring them onto the world stage to kind of help them integrate. But at the short term, if you come in too hot and heavy with it, you can risk alienating them. And in terms of geopolitical, competition, you really risk handing that relationship over to someone who is less scrupulous and more willing to just provide resources with no shaping of values whatsoever. And so a lot of times the special forces guy is put into this difficult positioning of being ambassador to a very questionable element, and sort of representing the values of the United States, but at the same time having to kind of, you know, smush your way into being able to work with people who are substantially more questionable. But at the same time, you don't want to give that up. And so it's that balancing act, I think, causes a lot of guys to end up with a lot of long-term harm trying to
Yeah.
just hold those positions in their heads. And it doesn't help the community either, because a lot of times the community will have, catastrophic failures. We see them not frequently, but not that infrequently either.
Well, I'm so glad you're thinking about this stuff. This is the sort of thing in my mind, Dan, that we really need people to think about outside of the military, but also inside the Pentagon. I worry with this current administration and this current, frankly, Secretary of Defense that there's not going to be a focus on that sort of stuff, and it's really, really important. But I want to get move on because there's a lot going on in our country
Mhm.
right now, particularly with the use of the National Guard in Los Angeles. So we're going to talk about that. Before we do, I just want to share with you what I'm drinking because this is a show also about whiskey.
Mhm.
And have you heard of this horse soldier? I brought
I,
this
ha-
out for you. Okay.
I have.
Do you know these guys? This is the Horse Soldier is a whiskey that is made by former Special Forces guys.
Mhm.
And so I figured, don't all Special Forces guys know each other?
It's funny. We're a little tribal, and so the different groups that are oriented against the different regions stay tight. So I was a seventh group guy, so I'm very Latin America focused. The guys who made that were fifth group, so they're very CENTCOM focused, very Middle East. And actually, I worked with one of those guys, Mike Elmore, for a long time, and he's the one that got me hooked on Horse Soldier. So I too have a bottle in my living room. It's wonderful. Unfortunately, it's the middle of the day, so I can't have it drink right this
Oh,
second.
come
But
on, don't
that's
say
a,
that now.
okay.
Come
No
on,
judgment.
Dan,
No,
you're
no
blowing
judgment.
my cover.
No judgment whatsoever. But I can't come home from the office smelling like booze, or I will I will burn rapport with the household.
I gotcha. That makes sense. All right. So Donald Trump has nationalized the National Guard and is deploying the National Guard right now on the streets of Los Angeles. And he's talking about deploying the active duty military, the United States Marine Corps, in the same manner. And this is the first time in 60 years in which a president has deployed the National Guard to a U.S. state over the objections of the state's governor. And in my mind, he's doing it for purely political reasons. But I really want to talk with you about this issue and just throw it out there. What are your thoughts right now on what's happening in Los Angeles?
So I can't see it without thinking of it in terms of a commander who got handed that mission and told, go execute. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of red team, blue team dynamic on, in terms of the president versus the governor versus the National Guard. And honestly, I'm not an expert on that. I, I wouldn't even want to begin to talk it, but I do know that if you were that poor Marine commander who is now put into a position where you need to pacify an area that is both violent and full of U.S. citizens, and to your point about the SecDef's focus on lethality, you end up in this weird position where, hey, you told me to train lethality, you told me to train to go kill people, you want me to go fight wars overseas, and that's usually it's straightforward in its way. We're going to go and we're going to
Hmm.
kill the people we encounter. And so missions like this, my concern as a commander is always every time you get this sort of pacification mission, like, okay, now these are going to be US citizens. It's going to be a police action functionally,
Hmm.
and it's going to be a really emotionally charged police action. And so you have to switch these guys that you've just told focus on lethality, kill, kill, kill. You have to shift their mindset entirely to say, all right, now you've got this entire code of how you interact with US citizens. You've got these entire set of responsibilities that come with policing, and that is super difficult because your
Yeah.
your your action arm is really like a 19 to 24-year-old who's a fairly feisty individual, and also not terribly well trained in the sense that they don't have a lot of breadth of experience. I mean, they know what they're
Mhm.
doing, they know their job, but to put them in a situation like that is just, to me, a massive risk, and it's difficult. It's
Yeah.
difficult for me to stomach it as a
Yeah,
commander.
what are the rules of engagement? I mean, this is really, really tough right now, and I just think that, well, first of all, the LA Police Department said that they had it under control. You know, the pictures are what they are. There's burning, cars. Well, there was burning cars when the Philadelphia Eagles, won the Super Bowl II in Philadelphia. I mean,
Of course
the
there
the
were.
the governor's not asking for it. The mayor's not asking for it. And so it to me, it's an escalation, and I really worry that, we send in sort of, potentially active duty troops to Los Angeles, or really the proclamation right now from the president says that he can send them anywhere, which is just unprecedented in my mind. And the concern is that, one, we you're taking the military away from training for what it's supposed to be doing, and you're deploying them on streets. And as you said, with young corporals, lance corporals, what there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong here in my mind.
There's a lot. There's an awful lot that can go wrong, and it's going to be super challenging if that gets executed in terms of the level of education you got to get these guys up to get them out there, and then how do they interact with the police? And you have again a combination of citizens, and then you have non-citizens on U.S. soil, and you just how do you even start to unpack this? And it's just fraught with a lot of things that go bad.
This is what John Kelly, who was former DHS head, former, chief of staff to President Trump during the first administration. This is what he was worried about when he said that the president would use the military in inappropriate ways. Secretary of Defense, then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, told the American public, "Hey, the president said that why couldn't we just use troops to shoot the protesters in the legs?" And it's really alarming. And one of the reasons, it's not just the alarming part of, oh my gosh, we're shooting, we're talking about shooting people who are just exercising their First Amendment rights, but also, what does this do to the military itself?
So
Meaning, we had this
yeah.
code, right, between the military and the civilians, and now I'm really worried about that fraying. What do you think?
So I personally, I hate the idea of the active duty military conducting operations inside the continental United States. I hate it. I'm not going to say there's never a time for it. I'm not going to say that it can never happen. Obviously, it's happened before, but I hate it because one, the short term impacts, as kind of we discussed with Marines in LA, are terrible. Right, you're going to end up with situations where people are coming in to do things that they're not really trained to deal with. They have no
Yeah.
policing training. That's not what they're supposed to be doing. But you also end up with the longer term kind of institutional damage. So the first time an active duty guy shoots a U.S. citizen, whether or not it's the right answer, it was a completely justified situation. The person's family is not going to feel like it was the right answer, and that's going to have trickle down impacts. I mean, you see a lot of like hatred for the police in a lot of parts of the
Mhm.
country. It's taken a long time to heal that, right? It takes a long time to kind of unwind damage. We saw it a lot on the ground in Iraq. If you shoot someone, the family's going to hate you forever. And it's different when you go home. It's you're not going home. You're in the states. You're in the United States, and so
Mhm.
I worry about what that's going to start to move toward. And I hope if it happens that it's an exception and it doesn't become the norm, because I think it would be a terrible precedent, and I don't want to see it go that way.
Yeah, I worry about, this was before you and I were born, but Kent State, and what happened during the Vietnam. I mean, that whole scenario, untrained troops in a place where, it was rioting, etc. But yeah, it was a disaster. And the American people, it took a long time for many in America to see the Army and the National Guard in a positive light after that one incident.
You could say some people never have, right? Some people still
Yeah.
don't, and it's not good. It's not different to me. It's not different than people alleging that the CIA does things within the bounds of the continental United States. Like it's not their mission. They need to stay out, and the military is kind of similar. The military needs to point out. It's not again, trying to resource to do things in, and in is very different. And I just want to keep that line as clean as we can.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to talk to you about the use of special forces in Mexico against the drug cartels. And for a lot of people, they may not know that this is even a thing, right?
Mhm.
So I'm going to get everybody up to speed here. Former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, this is during the first Trump administration, disclosed that President Donald Trump had privately proposed launching missile strikes against drug labs in Mexico. These were strikes that Trump reportedly said the US could deny responsibility for. This was during his first term. And now, here we are in the second term. The current Trump administration's border czar, Tom Homan, said that the president was, quote, committed to using the full might of the United States special operations to take them out, meaning the cartels. So in
Mhm.
February of this year, Trump put down an executive order. Now he's done many executive orders, so we haven't been talking about it so much on the news, but it's there, officially labeling these drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And that's sort of the opens up some doors for what
Mhm.
special operations, special forces can do. And many people have advocated for this aggressive deployment of special operations or special forces to combat the cartels. So I'll stop there and just ask you, what does direct action look like? And then we'll go into some of the hairy parts of this.
So, in general terms, direct action is specifically surgical strike. So the idea that you would go in and kinetically kill the people involved in that target. So it in the community, it's a pretty like definitive term. I think sometimes it gets used more loosely, so I can imagine that they're probably generalizing a little bit to other options. But one, I think you're right that the label of the organization or the cartels as terrorist organizations specifically opens up authorities and money. It specifically says
Mhm.
all of a sudden you can do these sorts of things as the military against these targets. And so if you wanted to make that happen, that is a necessary, well, not necessary, but it's probably one of the easiest steps you could do to allow it. Now, when you get into the nuance of this one specifically, so I did a lot of counter drug in Afghanistan toward the end of the war. So I was,
Mhm.
I guess, relatively highly placed in kind of making that some of that stuff happen. And a lot of people don't know, but there was a tremendous amount of meth that flowed through Afghanistan back then
Mhm.
because it was seen as a funding source. Now, one of the challenges we always had with that is a large portion of the drug cultivation industry is not bad guys per se, right? It's there are bad guys, and they're funneling this money into terrorist organizations. But a lot of the nug work down in the shop, the guys that are cooking the meth, the people that are dealing, running the wheelbarrows, they're just people, and a lot of
Right.
times they're kids and they're women. And so the idea that you're going to, start dismantling the cardinals or the cartels through surgical strike or direct action,
Mm.
I start to think about the fuzzy edges around it of, well, okay. I mean, there's definitely kingpins that you could work
Mhm.
on and you could kill. I get that for sure, but there's there's a high risk of collateral damage. And as you start looking
Mhm.
at collateral damage and you start bringing that closer to home, we don't have the most comfortable relationship with Mexico, and
Mhm.
as government to government. And there's a lot of history there, right? There's a lot of history. I mean, my great grandparents were growing up in Texas. Pancho Villa was still radiating across the border. Like there was a war not that long before that,
Yeah.
against Mexico. And so Mexico is very sensitive to the idea of U.S. involvement in their politics. And the idea that we're going to start killing Mexicans and Americans, let's not kid ourselves. Like there's a lot of people on both sides of the border that are involved in this. There's going to be U.S. citizens involved. There'll be dual citizens involved. There's going to be family members of U.S. citizens involved. And before we start killing people, we need to think about what the spinoffs of that are going to be. And I think LA is one of these spinoffs that you could see from that sort of effort. But you're also going to have tremendous amount of resentment built up really quickly if American missiles start killing
Right.
Mexicans,
Right.
whether or not they're involved in the fentanyl trade or the drug trade in general. And I don't want to downplay. I mean, fentanyl is super serious. The crisis is serious. I'm not going to pretend like there's an easy answer, but we should be very careful before we start having U.S. people killing Mexicans
Right.
in Mexico or in the states.
And and that's on the drone side, but like using special operations, I've heard this from lots of people. Why don't let's just send in the special operations, like raid these drug. I try to take it back. Well, first of all, you and I'd like to know your answer to this. What you would need the consent of the Mexican government, right? You would have to for it to be a successful operation, I would think, unless we're just gonna invade another country?
I mean, so if we looked at the Osama bin Laden raid as an example of what you could do without the
Mhm,
consent of the country, whether or not there was consent, I have no idea. I don't know to pretend to know, but let's assume there was not consent because they've already said there was a consent. That would be, to me, the best case you could hope for is that Mexico denies there was any coordination. We have attacked, we have destroyed this target. We went home. They're mad officially that we did that. We don't ever say that we did that. And that's kind of your best case. But to your
mm,
point, it could get a lot worse, right? It could get a whole lot worse because that's going to be, in terms of administration approval on the Mexican side. I mean, that administration could suffer huge political turmoil back home and get ousted immediately if there was a perception they were authorizing U.S. actions in Mexico. And how long could you really deny them? How many things could explode in northern Mexico before you're just it would start to look a little fishy pretty much
yeah,
instantly, right?
yeah. Yeah, and plus, as you said, that the cartels are deeply embedded in the local communities there. So you have to have a broader strategy than just I'm going to go in and take them out, right? Because you have to have a counter narcotics finance strategy. You have to have a counter insurgency almost because you're going to have members of the population there that are going to not be happy about this. There's a diplomatic
Yeah,
aspect of this that I always try to bring in. I mean, Mexico is our number one trading partner in the world. It's not China, it's Mexico. And
right.
that's kind of a big deal. We don't just raid into other countries typically, right? I know the Osama bin Laden case is a little different, but
Exception.
typically we don't go into other countries. And even if we did this with the consent of the Mexican government, it would be hairy because you talked about it earlier in this podcast. There's going to be retribution. Like there is, I mean, these cartels are well funded. The enemy has a say, and we have a lot of soft targets in the
Yep,
United States,
that's
right?
very true. That's very true. It would be hugely dangerous if they started to escalate, and then we'd escalate, and then kind of you look at like, well, where does it stop? But you brought up something really interesting, and that's the economic angle on this, and I think that makes it really approachable to people trying to understand the problem. So, in Colombia, a lot of times we were trying to do crop replacement because they're growing all this cocaine in Colombia for a lot of decades. Everybody knows that. It's kind of cliche. They tried to do crop replacement is to say, hey, look, stop growing cocaine and grow coffee. Coffee grows in Colombia really well. You can sell it. It's internationally available. But they bumped into tons of problems with this because one, the cartels would pay a lot more for the cocaine than you could ever get on the free market for coffee. And
Mhm,
the cartels would do the work. And if, by the way, if you switch to coffee, the cartel would kill you. And so there was a huge incentive to stay on cocaine and not switch to coffee, even though on the surface you would imagine that coffee would be a fine thing to grow. And every person beside the coffee grower has a similar stake. So every truck driver that is getting paid by the cartels right now to kind of quietly shepherd this thing across. Maybe he's not making a ton of money, but for him, he's making a ton of money. And so when
mhm.
you pull that out of the system, and all of a sudden, 50,000 people who were receiving a decent amount of money to do a service no longer get that, you risk immediately turning those people against you and saying, well, I miss the cartel because the cartel was putting food on my table. And
Yeah.
that doesn't defend what the cartel's doing. It's just a very pragmatic look at, hey, if you're going to do it, like it's going to take some effort to really get that solution in place, or you kind of risk causing this huge collapse. And it's challenging.
It is challenging. And I also think that there's some real risks here that aren't being talked about enough. For example, a lot of us, how many of us have vacationed in Mexico? I mean,
Guilty.
yeah. I mean, you're going to open up that can of worms. Well, now Mexico doesn't. I mean, I'm sure they want the tourism, but now you're looking at potential attacks against American tourists in Mexico, which the cartels have actually sort of avoided. Actually, they have avoided in many cases because they don't want Mexico to to lose that tourism.
Mhm.
Also, Mexico right now is cooperating with the United States to stem some of the flow of migrants through the border. I mean, I can just see Mexico saying, "Oh, you just did that. Well, we're not going to cooperate with you. We're just gonna let them go, let them go north, and that's gonna hurt our country.
It's tremendous risk, right? I mean, you have the question of how much capacity does the Mexican government have to even control the situation? Like, how much of the situation is only in control because the cartels kind of will it to be so? Like, they are not incentivized to cause us to start going to war with them, right? They don't want that to happen. That's very bad for business. They would much rather us just continue to buy their drugs quietly. But when you start looking at like, what are we going to do? Their ability to respond, as you said, pretty serious. And it's funny. You get stuck in this trap because you want to address the problem, but how do you address the
Mhm.
problem? Because if you address the problem, you're like, well, there's gonna be a lot of problems if I address the problem, and to an extent, you eventually have to pull the band-aid off and do something. But gosh, if you're too heavy-handed about it and you don't have it really well thought out, you can really make yourself a pretty huge mess, and that's my
Yeah,
biggest concern.
and Dan, you were doing this sort of operation in Afghanistan, right? And so
Mhm.
aren't these fentanyl labs, aren't these drug labs, aren't they sort of decentralized? They're kind of, sometimes small to find. They can be
Yeah.
easily rebuilt. So, striking and taking out a few of these, to me, it doesn't seem like it's going to fix the bigger problem. But how did it work in Afghanistan? I mean, and then also, did it work in Afghanistan?
So I 2021 probably would suggest that most of what we did didn't work in Afghanistan. So just like totally level it. Obviously, it didn't work very well. But I would say that in general, no, counter drug to me was always somewhat useful as a tool to force negotiations in Doha back when we were negotiating with the Taliban. Ability to interdict drugs and therefore cost them money was a useful kind of lever to pull to get them to make concessions or whatever. But I don't think we ever seriously destroyed the capacity to produce drugs because, as you said, once it's decentralized enough that well, okay, you blow up that lab, I'll build another lab. It does slow them down. It does kill those specific people, but it, it's hard to stop that machine as long as there's demand. To be frank, and that's to me that's like the elephant in the room. Like, well, as long as people want to buy drugs, I think they're going to continue to produce and sell drugs, and it's hard to imagine stemming that flow without addressing the number one problem, which is really people use a lot of fentanyl. And until they stop buying it, I
Yeah.
don't think that they're going to stop producing it.
Yeah, it was always interesting to me where people would really want to focus on, let's stop the drugs from coming across the border. And I know that we should be doing that. We should be doing that every chance we can,
Mhm.
but um it's a big border. And a lot of people don't also think about the fact that most of our borders are actually water.
Yeah,
So,
I mean the port of
I
Los
mean,
Angeles, right? The port of Los
yeah,
Angeles,
I
number one
mean,
in the country. A
it's
lot of stuff
just
comes in through
it's
the port
it's
of
a
Los
lot
Angeles.
harder than we think. It's just difficult. So, well, look,
It's
I want to talk to you about a little bit about a more broad look at America and the wars that we have been fighting since World War II, because Americans don't always get to hear from a special forces guy, right? And somebody who fought in elite forces. They might have a generalized thinking of that and what you think. And there's a current focus on lethality from the current Secretary of Defense. It's his big thing. President Trump has said in the past that he believes that we as a nation and our military institution no longer knows how to win wars. And I'm just curious if you can respond to that. What do you think about that? Just throwing it out there.
no, it's obviously a pretty inflammatory comment, right? I mean, the institution would be pretty irritated about that. And so I guess the way I would bumper sticker it is to say that the further up you go, the more accurate that statement is in the military. And here's what I mean. So at the lower echelons, I think that a focus on lethality is there. 100% it's there. And it's certainly been there since the end of the GWAT when Afghanistan collapsed. So mostly tactical training switched back to just force on force wartime training. And it's there. Junior leaders, they're there. Their minds are in the right places. They're absolutely capable of achieving military objectives, which kind of brings us back to that earlier. Like, well, maybe you don't want to put them on police actions, but that's what they're really good at. The trouble is I think at the senior leadership levels, you have seen at least in my career. Basically, careerism and this kind of idea that we manage wars, we don't win them, and that to me was one of the hugest scars that we took away from the GWAT is the idea that this war is kind of this permanent thing and we just manage it year to year. You go in for your year, 2 years, you go back out,
Mhm.
and I just make sure the slides all kind of move up toward green. The next guy will move them back into red, and we'll move them back up toward green, and you go to this cycle. And so to add a little more nuance to that, that mentality to me ultimately is caused by DoD responding to impossible policy objectives. So one
Mm.
of the things I talked a lot about in my book on Iraq is that really the military can do what you hand it the task to do, and it's the biggest arm of the government, and so it tends to get handed every task the government needs it to
Everything.
do, everything.
Mhm.
And so you're like, go rebuild Iraq, like
Mhm.
okay, I could destroy the military of Iraq. Absolutely could at that. The next day, when we were saying, could you get the power turned on? Could you provide jobs
Mhm.
for people? Could you economically stimulate this?
Mhm.
The DoD will do its best, but you're really grinding the gears to get that 19 to 20. I mean, I was 25 at the time. Like, hey, go build employment in your sector of Baghdad. You're like, well, okay. Um, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I'm going to take a crack
Right.
at it. And you had thousands of me's taking cracks at it, and
Mhm.
it produced a kind of incoherent patchwork quilt of successes and failures and this cobbled together sort of effort that you got out of it. But that's what a DoD solution to that statement, rebuild Iraq and promote democracy in the Middle East, looks like. And I don't know that the DoD can ever accomplish that. I think
Mhm.
the DoD probably can't accomplish that. And so, as long as we have this friction of like kind of, I would say bad policy, to be honest. If we have this hand me a policy that's impossible and I'm not going to achieve it, well, that's bad for both sides, right? You could have put a little more work into what you needed me to do. I There's no way I was going to achieve that, so I ended up coming out of it feeling kind of bad about myself, and my guys are kind of mistrained now. And as a
Mhm.
senior leader who grew up doing that, you get stuck in this mindset of just manage your 12 months, make it go as best you can. There's no way we can win
Yeah.
this, and then we'll get out of it at the end. And I think the movie War Machine actually captured the overall sentiment very, very well. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it
Yeah, I
was.
did see that movie. I mean, to me, it's this idea that the military we're asking the military to do everything. We didn't invest in diplomacy and development in the same way that we invested in the military, and that's not a judgment. I mean, we need to defend our country and everything, but I fear like your experience over there was similar to mine, and that I was a pilot, yes, but I still interacted with guys on the ground all the time. And I remember talking to one first lieutenant who came in to just coordinate for air support for something else, but he was like the mayor
Mhm.
of his town in Iraq. Like
Yeah.
his experience prior to me working with him in Afghanistan was one tour in Iraq. And in that tour, he was like that was his job. And he had no idea, just like you said, he had no idea how to do it, didn't have the expertise. We in Afghanistan, we would have entire battalions of Marines and we would have one person from USAID. And that one
Yes.
person had the PhD and the knowledge and the understanding of development, but no power. She was treated fairly poorly, in my belief, by the senior ranking Marines.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know if that was a gender thing or what, but she had the knowledge and understanding, and in many cases, she had the keys to some of the money that could be used for certain things,
Hmm.
but we just never figured that out until too late in my mind. And
Yeah.
but it was I almost feel like we have to think about this. There's this simplistic notion of winning
Hmm.
that this current administration had. Well, we got to win. We've forgotten how to win. Well, what is winning? I mean, in a fight like that, it's morphed um so many times, and it's almost an impossible situation, as you said.
It, it is challenging, and I think your diagnosis is pretty spot on, right? We invest heavily in the DoD. A lot of the other arms of government don't get a lot of investment, at least in terms of the kind of foreign apparatus. Don't have the investment and the size, the capacity, right? So even at the height of Baghdad and the surge. Were there. Everybody that I know in the army was in Baghdad in that period. I think pretty much everybody. Um, we still, I think, had two USAID guys at the brigade, and there were a couple old guys. I'm sure they were fine. I'm sure they did their thing, but you end up with this learning curve of, again, we're 12 months in, right? So we're going to do our 15-month rotation, and then we're going to go home. And so it takes us 6 months to even figure out what we're supposed to do at all, except just normal combat stuff. Okay, got it. And this is at all levels. This is the colonel down to me. Like, okay, 6 months in, we've gotten beat up enough. We figure out what we got to do. Another couple of 3 months, what tools do I have to achieve those things that I now see that I would have to do? And like, oh, USAID guys. Okay, I see who you are. Got it. Educate me on what you're doing. Meanwhile, you're still
Mm.
going out every day. You're doing your 10 hours. So 6 months later, you're like, I got this. This is really valuable, the service you provide. Come on, provide this for me. Help me out. Meanwhile, they've rotated once. And then by the
Yep.
end of your rotation, you rotate. And so we're
Yep.
two new people meeting each other again. And there just never ended up with that traction between the organizations to say, hey, we understand each other. We're here for the long haul. Let's work together to make this happen. And I think that lined up very rarely, if at all. And it certainly didn't line up enough to really make it work the way it should have. And it's
Yeah.
unfortunate. It kind of just feels like it was just kind of the way it ended up.
Yeah. And it is absolutely true to say that the United States has not done so well in the limited wars that we have fought since World War II. It's absolutely true statement. But when I read what Trump said, I found it to be extremely simplistic, and I also found it to be something that I really wanted to push back on because while it's true that that the military hasn't quote won in some of these limited wars, on the big strategic picture since World War II. In my mind, we have been extremely successful because we have kept great power peace since 1945 with a strong military. We've been able to deter the greater powers. We have undergirded a U.S. or U.S. led economic system, a world system that has brought out you know, some of the greatest movements in terms of scientific advancement, economic growth in human history. And it's all been done because we had, well, in large part, because of the United States itself and our economy and our values, but also because we had a United States military that was forward deployed that created stability around the world. And I just think we don't think about that enough. And, while the limited wars didn't go our way, we were successful in the big picture. And it goes back to like the whole Sun Tzu part of the best way to win a war is not to fight it at all.
Right. Right.
We've done
Here's
some
just
pretty cool things by having just this amazing military in which, and amazing war fighters like yourself that were nobody really wanted to go up against.
that's yeah. I mean, it's the Pax Americana, right? Like this kind of idea that since World War II, we just keep the peace, and by keeping the peace, trade thrives. And when trade thrives, mostly there's kind of money for people to do things with. And you would say, I think Matt Ridley's The Rational Optimist really lined this out really well. But this is this kind of idea that, well, everything's just a little better than it was. It's actually going okay. It's easy to focus on the things that are going rotten, but actually, most metrics would suggest that humanity is in a pretty good place. And in large part, it's because what you're talking about. There's no general war, right? I mean, limited wars, as bad as they may be, are not. There's just nothing compared to like the devastation that comes out of something when you get total war. And so by that metric, you would say, yeah, the military has done its thing. It's done its job. It's achieved strategic deterrence, which is kind of the technical term of saying we kept everybody from causing any trouble. Nobody's really done too much. I think a lot of people are worried that that's cracking around the edges right now. I think you see a lot of traffic that suggests people are kind of worried that that's starting to fray. I'm, I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure how completely. I'm just not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that one. I can see both sides of it. I can see you see situations like Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can see China saber rattling, and you can wonder if the wheels might fall off and the Pax kind of falls apart. But at the same time, I'm not sure that's going to happen. I tell you, I don't
Yeah.
want it to happen. I tell you, I really don't. I don't think
I
anybody
don't
does.
either, and it's one of the
So,
reasons that I'm so worried right now because I see bigger picture from the American political leadership, a leadership in the past that has been bipartisan in standing up for alliances. in standing up for democracy around the world to the extent that we at least had it in values. And I'm not talking about having our military go and impose democracy around the world. There's definitely has been debate about that in American foreign policy, but just the basics of, hey, we stand by our own values. We stand as a beacon for the rest of the world in terms of democracy. We stand up to um, autocrats and authoritarians like Vladimir Putin, at least in the past. And we stand with our allies who have the same values that we do. And I do worry that that is fraying, and what that means. That's my worry.
I share your worry. I wonder. To be honest, I'm politically independent. I kind of sit between the two sides, and as much as anybody in 2025 can do that. And I look at the things that I see, and I wonder if there's a level of sophistication behind the negotiation and the decisions that's going on, or if it's just kind of on its face, just kind of simplistic and bombastic. And I don't know the answer. I guess the answer is going to be I'll tell you in 4 years. We'll see. We'll see what's going on behind the scenes, and I hope that it's well thought out and it makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of the best I could do, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Well, now, Dan, you have your own podcast. And so can you tell us about that?
I can. So a friend of mine named Adam, he's a retired Navy SEAL. We met in grad school in California, actually, back when we were a decade younger. And we, since getting out, we both started writing, and we both kind of sit in, I guess you would say, the middle of the political spectrum. And we have this sense that we're both parents. So we're both parents of young kids. And so we have this sense that our kids are growing up in a pretty turbulent time. And we wanted to start this project to see if we could provide, I guess you could say, a voice of reason. We hope to provide a voice of reason for, in particular, young men who I feel like are a little adrift right now in terms of the messaging to them. I feel like young men are mostly told you're part of the problem, sit down, shut up, or you're told you need to be this dominant, ridiculous, like hyper testosterone, perpetual adolescent. And I want a more moderate voice that says, hey, no, you're part of the team. You got a role to play. Let's talk about what that role can be, and let's talk about how to make ourselves better people. Kind of moving into that, and it's called the Surf and Turf Show. And so we tackle parenting problems like self improvement kind of problems, and we try to put out a little bit of just, I hope, quiet humility and thoughtfulness into the internet to help people kind of through the turbulent
That
times.
that is awesome. That sounds really interesting. So Surf and Turf, everybody should check that out. And you've also written a children's book. Am I right about that?
I did. My daughter and I wrote a children's book. So she's 16 now and would probably be embarrassed. But when she was 10, we just sat down over COVID. Because we're like COVID. What can you do during COVID? Well, I guess let's write a children's book because we can't do anything else. Can't go to the park. Got to do something.
Mm.
And we just wrote. She had these little dinosaur toys that she had scribbled in her journal for pages and pages about all the things they'd done. I was like, I'm gonna help you turn one of these into a book, sweetie. And we did. We turned it into a book, and we went through the whole publication process, and I think it turned out pretty well.
That
It
is
was a lot of fun.
awesome.
It was
And if
good.
people
Danny
want to
thought it.
check all that out, they need to go to your website, right?
Absolutely. Please go to danielvpace.com or my Amazon author portfolio, and you can or profile, and you can check it out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for coming on this show, for talking to us about national security, about everything that's going on right now, and sharing your experiences and thoughts. We really appreciate you.
Oh, likewise, Amy. Thanks for having me on. It's just good to talk to somebody else who's trying to find that path, right? Just trying to find the path of reason through the now.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there is common sense in the world, and we need to be listening to people that, have been there and done that and can bring some of that calm, collected, thoughts to what's going on. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for what you do.
All right.